Hi everyone, on this cold and rainy day in October. Um, I thought we were going to go on to speak about chocolate, but in fact chocolate isn't much of an intoxicant. It does have caffeine, but it may relax you. It may be addictive because of the sugar, but it's really not in the same class of mind-altering intoxicants that we've been covering in this course. So I've decided to go on to rum, and partly because I'm actually drinking it at this moment on a Sunday. Nicely chilled. I feel like doing a pirate song or something. But let's explain why I'm going on to rum first among all the distilled beverages and especially in the context of what we were talking about in class the other day about world trade and exploitation of peoples around the world for the benefit of those wealthy mercantile colonialist countries. Because this rum, I think, is probably the best example of everything we've done thus far. Obviously, we've been talking about intoxicants for spiritual purposes, for social purposes, for trade, for commercial profit, for medicinal use, of course. But what is different about when we get to rum is the scale which we will encounter in the early modern period. We really haven't dealt with anything that has such enormous, very far-flung global consequences. In other words, not only is the whole world changed, but people around the world are moved, usually against their will. And the point I want to make here, in the larger scheme of the lecture, is that to supply Europe with cheap alcohol, rum is very cheap, still is today, we will have to discuss the practice of slavery on an unprecedented scale, nothing like in the ancient world. And of course, no drink better exemplifies the global consequences of this than rum. But we of course have to first figure out what rum is made with, where it comes from, and we'll have to start with sugar. Because in fact, if it weren't for the European sweet tooth, in other words, this kind of addiction to sugar used on food was a universal condiment throughout the Middle Ages and especially in the early Renaissance. Probably none of this would have happened. Why and how did people get addicted to sugar is really the most fascinating part of this whole question. Sugar is a grass. It's Saccharum officinalis. That word officinalis just means it's medicinal. It's native to the highlands of New Guinea, but there are also some species that are found in India. The one that is used usually is probably domesticated in New Guinea. But the Indians were the first to cultivate it and process it on a large scale. And in fact, the word sarkara in Sanskrit is the origin of the word in Arabic sukar, and the origin, of course, of our word sugar, as well as in almost every other language. It's the same word. Zucker, sucre, zucchero, it's the exact same word in every language. And it might be apposite to keep in mind that we humans instinctively like the flavor of sweet, right? That's a good thing to us. And when sugar was introduced in the West, I want you to think about the fact that there really were no other sweeteners per se. There's honey, there's grape syrup, what was called sapa in the ancient world. That was in late antiquity. And then, of course, the Romans, sort of knew a little bit about sugar as a drug, but they didn't really know where it came from. They didn't know how it was processed. It was not a common food. It's only in the Middle Ages that it becomes well known. And in fact, it's one of many spices that made their way to Asia from Europe, which we've discussed. And because it was imported on this long circuitous route, by the time it got to Europe, it was very expensive. And it served as a great status symbol. Remember that. It's along with pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from Ternate and Tidore, which is now Indonesia. Nutmeg came from Banda, which is not so far from there, and some other rare spices that have disappeared from the Western culinary repertoire, such as galangal and cubebs and grains of paradise that come from Africa. But sugar was just one of these expensive imports among many, used liberally on foods as a seasoning. Okay? And again, you could argue whether it's addictive or not. It could be. was largely the Venetians who carried these goods from the eastern Mediterranean ports and then distributed them to the rest of Europe. So the Venetians got really, really wealthy on spices and sugar included. Now, by the Renaissance, sugar was used literally on everything. Okay, it's pasta, chicken, meat, any obviously whole, and and sweet things weren't at the end of a meal, which we would think of as dessert. They were all over the place, and people loved candy. This was a candy-eating culture. The chefs of the era, the papal librarian and historian named Bartolomeo Sacchi, is called Platina, said that there is no dish which is not improved by the addition of sugar. So he thought, throw it on everything. That was in 1470. And it was not just at the end of a meal. This was every single course included sugar in it. And of course, it was, according to the humoral physiology of the day, considered a hot and moist food and therefore thought to be nourishing. So this was not something that was a dangerous indulgence or something you shouldn't really do. It was actually considered to be nutritious, really good for you. Eat sugar. It's sweet, therefore it must be nourishing, was the logic. Now, as one might expect, unlike the tropical plants, pepper and ginger and things that really wouldn't grow in Europe, there were attempts to cultivate sugar in Europe. It's proximate to the southern latitudes. There are places where it should grow. It needs subtropical heat and humidity. So Sicily, they thought maybe that would work. It's not ideal. It's a little too dry there because remember the Mediterranean climate gives you a long, dry summer and spring, so it needs moisture throughout the year. So but the right climate was found in a couple of islands off the coast of Africa that were owned by the Portuguese and Spanish. These are the Canaries and Madeira, and places where the local population, the Guanches, had already gone extinct because of European diseases. So the Spanish moved into these places and the Portuguese. And it happened at a very interesting time in history when the Portuguese at the same time had a king who sponsored navigation, who built new ships, had new techniques for navigating by the stars, new charts to map out the routes, and built bigger ships, better ships, the nau in Portuguese, and so they were sailing down the coast of West Africa in an attempt to find a sea route directly to Asia, which was the source of the spices. Now, of course, they did this. They succeeded eventually. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope. I think that's 1481 or so. And that ultimately, what that meant is that the Venetian route to Asia for spices was cut off by the Portuguese, who didn't have to go through all the Arab middlemen and other people who were carrying it ultimately from Indonesia. And the Portuguese did get all the way directly to India and Indonesia and cornered the whole trade for Asia for a generation or so. Obviously set up colonies. If you think of Macau in China and Goa in India, and Indonesia was, at least to start with, Portuguese. So you're wondering, why? What does this have to do with rum? It is connected, definitely. That rum is the first example of something that enters into global trade, and everyone at this point wants to get to Asia for the spices. But it turns out that for this story, the African islands are key. As I mentioned, they are inhabited by people called Guanches, who were cut off from the mainland for centuries, for millennia. And they not only, they had not developed a resistance to diseases that were prevalent in Europe and Asia and Africa, which share a common gene pool, because they were just cut off completely. So when Europeans arrived there, they suffered a devastating pandemic and pretty much disappeared off the face of the earth within a generation. And the colonists, settlers said, well, okay, we need labor. We're not going to set up, if we're going to set up a plantation, we don't want to move on feudal holdings. We want to have people whose labor we can use for nothing. So they decided to work these sugar plantations using slaves that they purchased on the mainland and brought there, and it worked very well. You buy a slave, and this journey was a few days or weeks. It was not a long journey, And for the most part, they purchased them. You know, we have this perception of people running onto the beach, grabbing Africans and just putting them in shackles and bringing them over. But usually they brought horses or guns or traded for other things. And there were tribes in the exterior which grabbed the people on the interior and sold them into slavery. Okay, that's the typical pattern. The reason I mention it here is because the exact same pattern of African slavery prevailed in the Caribbean as well. When the Spanish got there, the Native Americans likewise died from diseases, especially in the Caribbean islands, the Arawak and the Taino, and they needed labor. So they looked to Africa. The model that they followed was that of the Canaries and Madeira. And how this whole story switches, of course, to the Caribbean is the Genoese merchant Christopher Columbus was looking for spices, right? First and foremost, he's trying to get to Asia to buy spices and trade with them. And actually, what's really interesting is Columbus went to the Portuguese first. And by this point, they said, well, we're pretty sure that now we've gotten to the tip of Africa, we're going to be able to go into the Indian Ocean and sail all the way to Asia, no problem. So Columbus then went to the English, and the king at the time, Henry VII, said, well, we also already have a plan, and we've hired a Venetian merchant. His name is Giovanni Caboto. He's going to get us to North America, which is a much shorter route across than going around the equator, which, of course, you know, the Earth shaped sort of like an egg. If you go from England to Nova Scotia, it's much, much shorter. So they had a good plan. They didn't need him. And he even went to the French, who didn't really get into the act for another couple of decades, but it was the kind of last-ditch effort that he went to the Spanish, and Isabella and Ferdinand finally agreed to sponsor the voyage. Now, the reason they delayed for so long was not because they thought the Earth was flat. That was a story made up by Washington Irving in the 19th century, you know, the guy who wrote Sleepy Hollow and all that. But it was because they were actually really preoccupied. They were engaged in the conquest of Granada, which was the last Muslim stronghold in the south of Spain, and Granada finally fell in 1492. So it's no coincidence that the exact same year, all their plans fall into place. They kicked out the Jews in the same year, and then they launched the voyage to Asia, going by a western route, going around what they thought was the ocean. There's one ocean, we head to the west, and we'll go around and we'll reach Asia, right? That was not unreasonable for the day. A little tricky, because how do you bring enough food to make it across the one ocean? That's the hard part. So Columbus, you know, honestly, bumped into a Caribbean island by accident. He was not looking for anything. He was not a discoverer, at least at this point. He was trying to get to Asia and bumped into probably what's San Salvador Island or Watkins Island in the Bahamas. Little teeny island, but he got there and he thought, oh, this is Asia. And I want to make clear that to his dying day, Columbus thought he was in Asia, that he was on the proximate to Asia, and that even though he was definitely the first European to set foot on the mainland of America, which should have been named for him if anyone, it was not, and he really thought he was in Asia. So Columbus, you might know, turned out to be a terrible governor, and so these were not smoothly settled colonies at all. There was great tribulation and difficulty. But to cut close to the chase, these islands were inhabited by people. Of course, when he got there, he didn't discover anything. They were there for millennia. These were the Caribs, the Arawak, the Taino, native peoples who very quickly succumbed to European weapons and diseases, right? They were part of a different gene pool, and you know, if you go through generations without being exposed to a disease, your whole population becomes very susceptible. Just a basic biological principle. And they disappeared and by and large were replaced with African slaves. And the Africans, I should mention, did share the same gene pool with Europeans. So things like smallpox or measles wouldn't have been deadly to them. They would have survived those. And as it turned out, these islands are right on the same latitude. They have the right climate. They're humid. They're subtropical. They're perfect for growing sugar. Okay, that's the key to this whole story. And around the same time, the early 16th century, the Portuguese also, by accident, were following the trade winds which would have gotten them to the south part of Africa. They actually had to swing out into the Atlantic. They bump into Brazil. that's really the only reason that that's a Portuguese colony following that. And the same exact pattern happens there as they start importing African slaves from what's now Angola, Mozambique. Those are also Portuguese colonies down the road. But they are, as much slavery for sugar as in Brazil as in the Caribbean. So let's move this story forward because we're not quite to rum yet. To the 17th century, the world was. Let me explain how the Spanish and Portuguese settled this. What could have been potentially pretty bitter rivalry among them throughout the world. Well, the Pope at the time, this is Alexander the Sixth in the 1490s, said, okay, let's divide the whole world between the two of you. Drew a big line down the middle and said, okay, everything on one side belongs to Spain. That's would eventually be the Americas, and everything on the other side, Africa, Asia, any colonies you find, that belongs to Portugal. It's a big quite audacious, split between the world. And the what that means is that the massive Native American empires, the Aztec and the Inca, were controlled by the Spanish, very different pattern of colonization, and the Portuguese in the East meant the spice trade, right? Asia, whatever they found there. Now, they couldn't conquer these places. They were far more, they were very well populated with people who were powerful enough to defend themselves and who shared the same genes, same diseases with the Portuguese. So they set up little feitoria, little trading posts that eventually became cities in Asia. But the Portuguese did not conquer and control the way the Spanish did. So, if you think back a couple of lectures, the Spanish colonists, remember, were importing wine and brandy. They began fiddling around with distilling agave, that's the ancestor of tequila. And they would have known by this point that you can also ferment sugar. It is actually the easiest thing in the world to ferment. Remember, it is the yeast breaks down the sugar itself to make alcohol. So if you start with sugar, now you wouldn't do that really, because sugar is actually pretty expensive and rare and still exotic at this point. So to spend that to make alcohol would have been really cost prohibitive. It's much easier to use grapes or grain or whatever you have sitting around, right? But when the price of sugar goes down, it's a very different story. Okay? And I should also mention that if you just ferment sugar on its own, it doesn't make a very palatable drink. It's really kind of nasty. But it is the most basic form of fermentation, and when distilled, it will give you, at this point, the purest form of alcohol. You can do it very simply in a still. So let's give you the chemistry, because I think that's actually kind of interesting and important. So the sugar we're talking about to start with, the kind your cells use in your body, is glucose. Okay, that's good old C6H12O6. Okay, the simplest sugar. Plants store this as starch, or they store it as a related thing called sucrose, which is C12H2411. It's just got one little oxygen molecule less. But the sugar, that's the only place you can get sugar that is really worth your effort in distilling, is sugar cane, which, remember, grows all the way out in New Guinea and India, and sugar beets. Those are the only two plants that have enough sugar that it's actually worth the money processing and creating sugar out of. Though now you can, of course, make sugar out of agave or dates or maple. You can dehydrate, make great sugar out of, which has fructose and other things in it as well. So what happens is the yeast breaks down this into C2H6O, and that's a very simplified description of the chemical structure, but it breaks it down into a simpler sugar. And then distilled fermented sugar syrup, the first form of it, is called aguardiente, which just means strong water, or fire water actually in Spanish. or in Portuguese it's called cachaça. You'll find that still to this day in Brazil. If you want a good caipirinha, it's made with cachaça. So they're the same thing, but aguardiente can be made of pretty much anything, fruit, grain, whatever. It's a generic term for spirits, like aquavita. But the real thing is made of sugar, okay? So at the turn of the century, there are several failed attempts to settle in the New World by the English, right? I mean, they only get into the game a century later, and likewise with the French and the Dutch. Those are the three new superpowers in the 17th century. They muscled their way into colonies pretty much around the globe. The English, for example, found Jamestown in Virginia. The French found Quebec. The Dutch, of course, New Amsterdam. So they're dividing the coast of the east coast of what's now the United States between them. And their majority of their efforts are actually focused, the Dutch at least, on stealing the Portuguese empire away. They take part of Brazil for a while, but really the gem, what they really want, is Indonesia. And they succeed in that. And then there's also the Caribbean, right? The key islands, some of these are actually stolen from Spain. So Jamaica in the 1650s is stolen from Spain by the English. Trinidad and Barbados become English islands. The French take Martinique, Guadeloupe, and eventually Haiti. All these are still French-speaking places. Haiti's independent, of course, but the Martinique and Guadeloupe are actually departments of France. They're literally part of France. They're not even colonies anymore. And then the Dutch take islands like Curacao, Bonaire, Aruba, and Suriname, which is on the mainland and next to Venezuela. And these are all devoted to sugar production. Okay, that's first and foremost. They are populated almost entirely by African slaves, looked over by a handful of plantation owners who would supervise them. If you think of, like, say, Jamaica, whole population is African. Later on, a few Indian and, very, very small white population. And it is precisely on these islands we're talking about in the Caribbean that rum is invented. For example, Barbados, probably the key, one of the key sugar plantation colonies. The chief fuddling they make in this island, I'm quoting here, is a rum bouillon, alias Kill Devil, and this is made of sugar cane distilled, a hot, hellish, and terrible liquor. Okay? Now the funny thing is that rum is actually not made of sugar at all. It's made usually from molasses, which is a byproduct of sugar manufacture. If you're making sugar, you're going to sell this stuff. People will buy it. It's still expensive. But the processing means you have this sludge left over that's still sweet, which you can actually distill, which is molasses. So it's kind of an adjunct to your lucrative sugar business. You could run a distillery on the side, or you could sell the molasses to someone else and let them distill it. So this alcohol, again called Kill Devil first, was drunk by the islanders. It was traded with any passing ships. And so it's literally the first beverage that would go globally. In other words, that would be traded around the world and shipped very, very long distances, not just between, European ports, but this really goes everywhere. And the word is said to derive from a word that's in Barbados as slang. This is rum bouillon, which means a brawl or a tumult when you're fighting with someone. Perhaps that's what happens if you drink a lot of it, right? Maybe. But there are a lot of sort of folk etymologies of where the word comes from. It might be a shortening of the word saccharum, which is the Latin word for sugar. Doesn't make much sense. You wouldn't, why would you take off I don't know how that would happen. But there is also another drink called rum-fustian, which is much, much older. It's a combination of beer, eggs, and spices, and that never made any sense to me either. How would you get beer, eggs, and spices into something that's a distilled clear liquor? So It's been suggested that the Dutch word actually, the word actually comes from the Dutch word for rummer, which is a little glass like this, very much shaped like this. Usually they have little bumps on the outside made of glass, so when you hold onto it, your greasy fingers don't slip off. So this is pretty much a rummer shape, or romer if you see the word in German. In the end, the word doesn't really matter that much. The word rum is in place by the mid 17th century and was referred to as such globally by that point. So if you went to, say, Connecticut or Massachusetts, you could buy rum. That's what it's called. Okay. Here's the other fun thing about rum: is it is indestructible. It will never go bad. You can heat it up. You can take it anywhere around the world in transit, and it will not decay ever. So it makes up the rations of anyone you want to give drink to. Slaves also. It keeps them quiet. It's much higher in alcohol. You can add other things to it, of course, to flavor and make it a little more palatable. Eventually it becomes the ration for sailors, as we talked about in class. Is the British government realizes beer takes up a lot of volume. It does go bad, especially in humid heat. So why not just give the sailors rum, add a little lime to it, and prevent scurvy or whatever, and a little sugar, and you've got a really nice drink out of this whole thing. So this is so the rum watered down with a little sugar and lime added is of course prevents scurvy, as I say, but it's supposedly named for the inventor of this drink, Admiral Edward Vernon, who wore this big waterproof coat, which is called grogram. That's the name of the fabric, and so this drink became known as grog. So it is said. Okay. As it turns out, the term actually is used before that admiral was born. So presumably, this drink, grog, gave the British Navy an advantage over other nations because they had a lower incidence of scurvy, and therefore the British Empire would survive because of the limes in their rum. And surprisingly, the ration of rum was only abolished in 1970. Amazingly enough. The Queen still has a right to give a special order, which is called to splice the main brace. Now, let me explain what that means. You have a rope, you splice it, you pull the rope apart, you put another rope in, you retie the other end, and it will not come out. So to splice the main brace means that you get a double ration of rum on this special occasion. And the Queen still does it. I can't remember the last time she did, but this is her right as Queen to offer double rations of rum. So rum, of course, if you go into a liquor store, you'll see that rum is produced throughout the Caribbean, and I'll come to the descendants of these drinks, but it was also distilled from about the 1660s in North America. Staten Island had the first major distillery. Boston then became the center for rum manufacture, and it became more profitable to ship the molasses north rather than try and distill it in the Caribbean, because you need a lot of wood, you need, the equipment and everything to do this. The equipment actually is very complicated, but the thing you don't need is manpower. Manpower is cheap in the Caribbean. It's relatively inexpensive in Boston because you have lots of people around, and you can, of course, put them to work for low wages. So it made much more sense to have the cane processed in the plantations, and then the leftover of this whole process, the molasses is what we're talking about, is sent to the North America and then distilled there. It's a lot more complicated than it sounds, in the traditional description of the triangular trade route. But it became, surprisingly, New England's largest industry. So we shouldn't forget that the foundation of our country, and certainly it's the mainstay of the Boston economy, was partly fishing for cod, but it was rum, definitely also. So this what I'm talking about here, I'm sure you've learned this in grade school. The triangular trade route is, usually claimed it's, one thing goes, slaves go this way, rum goes this way, whatever. But it's in its classical form, the idea is that the Europeans would send manufactured goods and textiles to Africa, pick up slaves there, sell them in the Caribbean, buy the sugar, the cotton, the tobacco, in one of the ports, either in the Caribbean or North America, and then they'd go back and send the whole thing over again. So it's sort of a triangle. But another way to see this is that the sugar and molasses went to New England also, where it was refined and turned into rum, and then sent to Africa to trade for slaves. The rum itself actually was sent to Africa, and then they were sent to the Caribbean. So it's a little more complex. And the pattern, nonetheless, slaves do get brought to the Caribbean in staggering numbers, millions of people. Many of them died on the passage across. And the consequence for our story is that, yeah, I mean, many people suffered and died and went into slavery, but also rum goes out in unprecedented volume. It's the first really cheap distillate sold globally. Okay, I mean, before we were talking about aquavit, and people could buy it as medicine and have a little more extra tipple if they wanted. But this is the first stuff that's really produced on an industrial scale and shipped across the ocean and can be bought for very little, and will get you quite hammered if you drink enough of it. And in the ensuing century, rum does go everywhere the British do. Standard drinking Canada, eventually Australia, New Zealand, and of course with the industrialization of alcohol, it becomes one of the few drinks you can find anywhere on earth. Okay? And I'm sure the association you will have with rum, as many people, is of course pirates. Pirates don't make rum, they drink it. And we have the association largely to thank Robert Louis Stevenson for this. And here's the description of the character Billy Bones in Treasure Island that he offers us. He was only once crossed, and that was toward the end when my poor father was gone in a decline and took him off. Dr. Livesey came over one afternoon to see the patient. He took a bit of dinner from my mother, and he went into the parlor to smoke a pipe until his horse should come down from the hamlet, for we had no stabling at the old Benbow. This is the inn where they're staying. I followed him in, and I remember observing the contrast of the neat, bright doctor with his powder as white as snow. This is his starched wig, right? And his bright black eyes and pleasant manners, made with the coltish country folk, and above all, with that filthy, heavy, bleared scarecrow of a pirate of ours, sitting far gone in rum, with his arms around the table. Suddenly he, the captain, began to pipe up his eternal song. 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. You know the song. Drink to the devil and done with the rest. Yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum. Now, I don't know whether Robert Louis Stevenson, forged the song is certainly recorded by him, but it's another explanation is that if you wanted to steal something and you were in the Caribbean, rum is a great thing to steal. It's worth a lot, and it's so. In any case, they would have stolen it, and that's why they drink it. You wouldn't make a very good pirate, swilling champagne or twirling a martini or anything like that. It's to a feat. Rum is much more efficient. So let's talk about the types of rum. So the rum, mostly what we consume in the U.S., this kind of clear stuff that we think of as a mixer, is actually a Spanish style of rum. Okay, it comes originally from Havana. You might know Havana was once a U.S. possession. And if you're watching the news now, I heard this morning that we will eventually be able to buy as much Havana rum, like Havana Clubs is the brand, and cigars as we want after the trade embargo since right when I was born, in fact. This will finally be lifted. Of course, since that embargo, we have not bought rum from Cuba. We buy it largely from Puerto Rico. And of course, Puerto Rico is one of the last vestiges of the American empire, right? It is not a state. They don't vote for a president, but they are a possession of the United States, along with places like Guam and the American Virgin Islands. The company, as you will know, and it is actually what I'm drinking now, is Bacardi, right? This is the company that started in Havana and then eventually went to Puerto Rico. It's light. There's also a darker version that they color with caramel for no good reason. It doesn't have much flavor, which is why we put it in. It's a little sweet, but we put it into cocktails, some of which are splendid, some of which are absolutely abominable. And obviously, the association with the Caribbean has suggested some of the classics, mixing with citrus or tropical fruits and so forth. Now, this kind of rum is quite different from the kind that they still make there. So, if you go to Jamaica, say, or Barbados, the rum there is aged in a barrel. So, it's not caramel coloring that makes it a little different. This is, it's light brown. It tastes a little like the molasses it's made of. And the way you drink it is sipping it like this. It's not to be mixed into a drink. The one that you probably will see easiest is Mount Gay. That comes from Barbados. Or Appleton Estate from Jamaica is also very nice. And in fact, there's a distillery tour that's not too far from Montego Bay if you ever take it on Appleton Estate, which is really, really quite fascinating. The original places they would crush the cane and make everything. So this is, they did make rum in the Caribbean, and it's still made there today. They don't produce it on a small scale in pot stills anymore, but there are some very well respected artisanal rums now. Now again, we'll wonder what that word actually means when you make it on a huge scale. But it's Pusser's Navy Rum, Gosling's Black Seal. These are both actually very good, and there are every year half a dozen more rum varieties come out, claiming that they're artisanal and made in small pot stills and are traditional. And some of these, and this is going to be a little confusing for you. I hope it's not too confusing. Is that some of these are actually not made of molasses, because if you're primarily trying to make rum, sugar is really, really cheap nowadays. It's much easier to make out of sugar. So there are actually rums made just out of sugar. And in fact, strangely, this is the traditional way to make what is called rhum agricole, which means a kind of artisan agricultural rum in French, which is made from cane syrup. It's not made from molasses. There's no reason for them to take the sugar out and sell it because it's worth nothing. Now, especially we have sugar beets, right? And it does have a very different flavor, I find. The only reason it began to be produced this way is when an industrial process to make sugar from sugar beets was invented in the early 19th century, and all of a sudden the price of sugar plummeted, and the French colonies said, well, why are we making it out of molasses? Let's just make it directly from the sugar cane, and squeeze out the juice and distill it. It should be simple, and in fact it is. So today, the rum, and this is spelled R-H-U-M, strangely enough, that's made in Martinique and French colonies, actually has an appellation d'origine contrôlée, meaning that it's like wine. It has a very specific place it's allowed to be made and will carry a certain name of its origin. That's the way it's sold. And these are remarkably good. They're very different from other Caribbean rums, but I would say to try them, give them a shot. And literally, as I said, every time I look at the aisle of rums, there's another few that come out, and some are very nice. They can be woody, they can be aged, and quite pleasant to sip. But as you know, most of the rum ends up not being drunk like this. It goes into a cocktail. And the first proper cocktail of any kind is rum-based before any others. And we haven't talked at all about cocktails, okay? We've talked about flavored wines and flavored alcohols and things like that. But this is something you have the pure alcohol and then you mix it with something else to make it palatable or more interesting at home. So the first kind of cocktail is what is referred to as punch, okay, or rum punch. If you remember from Mary Poppins, she takes a spoonful of rum punch as the flavor of her medicine. In any case, this appears about 1670s, and it dominates cocktail culture all the way until the early 19th century. If you're talking about a cocktail, it's rum punch. And punch is not always based on rum per se, but it's the one that eventually comes to dominate because it becomes cheap and available and everything. So let me give you a little history of punch, where that comes from. So it's mentioned by as early as 1576 by George Gascoigne in a book called The Delicate Diet for Dainty-Mouthed Drunkards, which is really quite delightful. It's a concoction of sugar, lemons, spices that you soak in an alcohol called arak. And I'll mention that. Arak is distilled in the Middle East and through Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. It's quite different. It's the indigenous drink there. It can be made from a lot of things. Palm sugar can be made from other dates sometimes, but it's eventually made out of sugar. Okay, so that's the first kind of imported alcohol that people get is arak. But to this they would add tea and water. And when the English finally get to India, they adopt this name for this combination of sugar, limes, spices, tea, and alcohol, right? So you can probably guess where the word comes from. Punch, with an A, is Hindi. Okay, it's an Indian word. It means five. That's how many ingredients we have so far, right? Five. It entered the English language in 1632, and within a decade or two, rum replaces the arak and it becomes the drink of choice. The British import it all the way from their Caribbean islands, just like they were doing with tea from India in Boston, right? They're selling the rum for the Caribbean, sometimes distilled in Boston, back in India for their colonists there. Amazing, isn't it? So the rum does become the standard ingredient, and the standard Bajan, which means from Barbados, Barbadian rum punch. This is the combination. The proportions are like this. You have 1 of sour, 2 of sweet, 3 of strong, 4 of weak, and that means 1 part lime juice, 2 parts sugar, 3 parts rum, 4 parts water at this point, in places the tea. And then you have a little bitters and maybe a scraping of something like nutmeg or something will go in to give it a little spice. There's another version of this which is a little more complicated. This is called Planter's Punch, which is standard. Includes dark rum rather than light. It's there's probably a little curacao in there, which is a liquor made out of the orange peel and sweetened as a liqueur on the Dutch colony of Curacao. A little grenadine, which is a pomegranate kind of syrup, which you find, of course, in cocktails still to this day. You find bitters, and we haven't talked about those at all, but those are usually the distilled bark or spices or some kind of flavorings. Today you find hundreds of bitters. They've just exploded. In the past, you really could only find Angostura. That was the made out of a bark called Angostura. Or maybe Peychaud bitters in Louisiana, but they're usually red and bitter and slightly sweet, but there's alcohol in it to keep it. So Angostura bitters go in this, and of course they go into lots of cocktails today. Sometimes they'd add pineapple or orange juice also. So Planter's Punch is Jamaican in origin, but that's not where the name comes from. It actually comes from Charleston, South Carolina. The Planters Hotel invented this stuff when they got all these ingredients and served this tropical kind of mix that people loved. There are a lot of variations. West Indian punch includes ginger. Barbados punch could include guava jelly, and I know that sounds really weird to us, but jelly actually mixed into rum is wonderful because it sweetens, gives a little fruit flavor. It's actually kind of wonderful. That's common actually in the Caribbean. To spoon a spoonful of jelly into your rum. But whatever goes into it, I want you to think of how punch on both sides of the Atlantic becomes the party drink. If you throw a party, this is the 18th century, you have a bowl of punch. Okay, it's absolutely requisite. And it's a very different kind of social event than drinking was in the past, because you've got rum in it. Sometimes you have brandy in it, which of course comes from France. Sometimes some Madeira wine, which comes from Portuguese colony in Madeira. Sometimes white wine would go into it too. Then you'd throw in flavorings, things like orange peel, sometimes whole fruit. But the point is, it's very different because you leave the punch bowl out. Everyone has a cup, there's a big ladle, and it's a way that elegant people can help themselves to, if they want, vast quantities of alcohol without having to call forth a servant or a waiter or someone to bring it to them. Because of course with a bottle you have to pour, whatever. The punch bowl's out there, everyone takes whatever they want. Okay? And I think a pretext for some serious tippling. Um, and the point is that you can also really hide the quantity of alcohol in there because it's got the acid and the sugar, and you don't really taste how much you're drinking as you're drinking it. So it's fine for elegant ladies in the era of, think Jane Austen. She would not have gone to a party without a proper punch bowl out. It also works outside. You have a garden party, you put a punch bowl. If someone spills, who cares? Okay? But most importantly, this is a communal drink. Everyone takes from it as they like. You gather around it, you dance, you do whatever, but there are no bottles to fiddle with. No one's opening it, no one's pouring, no one's saying anything. You just take whatever you want. Or when you have a holiday party and you don't know who's going to show up when, and they might leave at some point, you can just put out a punch bowl. And the punch bowls themselves are beautiful, elegant, sometimes glass, sometimes porcelain. If you had a punch bowl that came from China, even much better. And if you're nobility, of course, it's silver or maybe even gold, something precious. And you'd have matching little cups with cute handles, and it is the quintessential drink of the early 19th century. So I have to share a recipe with you, of course. This is the Regent's punch. He becomes King George IV, but when he's regent, he kind of sets the fashion in the early 19th century. So, and I just want to give you a sense of how interesting and complicated and lovely this drink is. So, pare as thin as possible the rinds of 2 China oranges, and by that he means the sweet orange, 2 lemons, and 1 Seville orange. That's the bitter kind that originate or grown in Spain. Okay? And infuse them for an hour in half a pint of thin cold syrup made of sugar and water, and then add to them the juice of the fruit. Make a pint of strong green tea. That's interesting. Green tea was very popular back then. Remember, it's not until recently now. Sweeten it well with fine sugar, and when it is quite cold, add it to the fruit and syrup. Add a glass of the best old Jamaica rum. She's talking about a big glassful. A glass of brandy, 1 of arak. They're still using that Middle Eastern drink. 1 of pineapple syrup. Oh, how wonderfully exotic. Pineapples, oh my gosh. 2 bottles of champagne, and pass the whole through a fine lawn sieve. You're passing it through a cloth so all the spices come out until it's perfectly clear. Then put it into a bottle and put it into ice until the dinner is served. So you have this thing that's completely chilled. Now we are indebted to this receipt to a person who made the punch daily for the prince's table at the Carlton Place for 6 months. It has been in our possession for some years and may be relied upon. This was published by Eliza Acton in the book called Modern Cookery for Private Families, 1849. And think about this, really, it's for ordinary people who buy this book to say, oh, I want to drink a punch just like the regent is having, or the king, and I want the best recipe that could be had so I can imitate him. And if I'm socially aspirant, I can be like him. And people come over to my party and they go, ooh, you're serving a punch like the king has. It's wonderful. You could see why this. And it's not really expensive. I mean, there's nothing in there that's crazy. It's sophisticated, and lovely. So you would never guess the most famous punch enthusiast, actually just to the point that it's going out of fashion, really, is Charles Dickens. And I want you to remember The Ghost of Christmas Present, at which, because he's remembering there are seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. And Dickens actually had his own favorite punch recipe that he came up with himself and sent the letter with the recipe to a friend. So I have to share this with you because it's actually much more complicated, more interesting. So peel into a very strong common basin, which may be broken in case of accident without damage to the owner's piece or pocket. So don't use your best china for this, he says. Peel the rinds of 3 lemons cut very thin with as little as possible of the white coating between the peel and the fruit attached. That's the pith, it's the bitter part. You want that out of there. Add a double handful of lump sugar, good measure. A pint of good old rum, and you can age rum, believe it or not, yes, especially if it's been in oak. And a large wine glass full of brandy. If it not be large, be a large claret glass, say 2. Okay, so say if you have a bigger glass, use 1, smaller one, use less. Use 2. Okay, set this on a fire by filling a warm silver spoon with the spirit, lighting the contents at a wax taper. So you're taking a spoon, putting it over a flame, and then pouring them gently in. Okay, so the whole thing's going on fire. This is rather dramatic. But it changes the flavor, actually, in a very interesting way. Let it burn for 3 or 4 minutes, stirring from time to time, then extinguish it by covering the basin with a tray, which will immediately put out the flames. You're actually burning some of the alcohol off, but you're giving it a very lovely toasty flavor. Then squeeze the juice of 3 lemons in a quart, add a quart of boiling water, stir the whole well, cover it up for 5 minutes, and stir again. At this crisis, and he's using the medical term in an operation, okay, or in a disease, a critical moment is what he means. Having skimmed off the lemon pips with a spoon, this is the seeds there, you may taste it. If not sweet enough, add sugar to your liking, but observe that it will be a little sweeter presently. Pour the whole into a jug, tie a leather or coarse cloth on top so as to exclude the air completely, and let it stand in a hot oven 10 minutes. This is really bizarre, right? Or on a hot stove a quarter of an hour. Keep it until it comes to the table in a warm place near the fire, but not too hot. He doesn't want this thing boiling. Okay? If it be intended to stand 3 or 4 hours, take half the lemon peel out, or it will acquire a bitter taste. He's done this many times. He knows. The same punch allowed to cool by degrees, and then iced is delicious. It requires less sugar when made for this purpose, and if you wish to produce it bright, strain it into bottles through silk. And these proportions will of course apply to any quantity. This was a letter he wrote to Mrs. F, who was Amelia Austin Philono in 1847. Dickens was an aficionado, so to speak. Now, I will have to tell you, of all the rum cocktails, and there are many, many of them, there's one that if you happen to go to Jamaica, you will become enamored of, as I was many years ago. This is called the No Problem, which of course you can imagine people there saying, "No problem, man," and making this cocktail for you. And despite what anyone tells you, and despite all the completely dreadful recipes you can find online, this is just a lot of lime juice, pineapple juice, Jamaican rum, and coconut milk. Nothing else. That's it. So it is really no problem to make. You should not put cranberry juice in it, no matter what anyone says. You should not put in coconut-flavored rum. And banana liqueur is just vile, nasty stuff. So don't bother with that either. Unless you get confused between this and a very similar cocktail, which is also quite charming, but very different. It is called a pina colada, right? Which is from Puerto Rico, and that's light rum, pineapple juice, and a sweetened coconut syrup. That's Coco Lopez they often use, or coconut milk with sugar. But that is, it's a beautiful combination. It's great on the beach. I love a good pina colada, but that's very different from a No Problem, which shouldn't be sweet, because the sweetness gets kind of cloying when it's really hot out, and when you have enough lime in there, it is it's great. Okay, it's great. The other cocktail, which I have to say is so often bastardized in versions that are just deplorably heinous to look at or taste, heaven forfend, but when made well are gorgeous. Let's talk about the daiquiri. That's a beach in Cuba, popularized after 1900 when business interests flooded into Cuba when it was an American possession after the war with Spain. And it's not that different really from grog, if you think about it. It bears some resemblance to this ancient ancestor, but it is basically lime juice, sugar, and ice with rum poured over. You can strain it, you can shake it so the ice actually makes everything cold. Either way is fine. But if you go into a place and order a frozen strawberry daiquiri that's made with some sugary frozen syrup and garbage, I'm not even going to mention that. Okay, I'm going to leave that out of the equation entirely. A few other drinks that are kind of cocktails that are indicative of rum cocktail culture, let me mention the Cuba Libre. This is a great thing. It's a legitimate drink, has a fascinating history unto itself. It's basically just Coca-Cola, yes, lime, and rum. And the company that makes the rum, Bacardi, claims this. The world's second most popular drink, I don't know what the first is, was born in a collision between the United States and Spain. Absolutely true. It happened during the Spanish-American War. I'm reading their copy, okay? At the turn of the century, when Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and Americans in large numbers arrived in Cuba. Actually, I'm not quoting. These are my words. And one afternoon, the story goes, a group of off-duty soldiers from the U.S. Signal Corps were gathered in a bar in Old Havana. Remember, Havana is a really old colonial city. And this young messenger named Fausto Rodriguez later recalls that Captain Russell came in and ordered a Bacardi Gold rum with Coca-Cola on ice with a wedge of lime. And the captain drank the concoction with such pleasure that it sparked the interest of soldiers around him, and they wanted the same. And so the bartender prepares a round of drinks for everyone, and the Bacardi rum and Coke was an instant hit. And as it does to this day, the drink unified the crowd in a spirit of fun and good fellowship, and they ordered another round, and one of the soldiers suggests that they toast por Cuba Libre, because Cuba was freed from Spanish control. Okay, that's the freedom Cuba got. Of course, they've gone through many other rounds of freedom, including this morning, maybe. So the captain raises his glass and inspired the Cuba's victorious soldiers in their War of Independence. Blah blah blah. So there are a lot of impossible particulars to this story, but the origin is actually right about here. It's about 1900 or so. It's not in 1898, but still, it's very, very close. And we tend to call it just a rum and Coke, but it is the original has lime, and it's a Cuba Libre. Another drink, which is also ranks up there among these immortals, is called a mojito. This is light rum, sugar cane juice, lime, but the addition of mint makes it a whole other creature entirely. You can add soda water too and make it into a highball, meaning a tall glass. And the legend goes that this was originally called El Drac, after Sir Francis Drake, who invaded Cartagena de las Indias in 1586, but dysentery broke out among his crew, and some people were sent ashore to find a remedy, and they gave him this combination of muddled mint, leaves, sugar, and the aguardiente to drink, and yummy, yummy, he was cured. So the word mojo, of course, means sour, used as a marinade or whatever, but this is a little version of that. Mojito means a little sour thing, used as a drink. Of course, more nonsense, right? I mean, but think about it. This is the stuff that these companies use as great advertising, and I want you to think about this as you're working on your little projects for the class. Is you can sell anything if you spin it well. So let's talk just a little bit about cocktail culture, because it goes through successive waves in history, and I think there are periods that, like 19th century Victorian era, like the 20s and 30s and the bootleg era of gin and prohibition, and of course in the 50s and 60s in the era of Mad Men. And for reasons that I find very fascinating, right now we're in a cocktail culture again, when so cocktails go through these revival periods every now and then. And I'm trying to imagine what it is that these periods have in common. What would make people turn to mixed drinks over beer and wine? And why do cocktails also fall out of favor in some generations? The 70s and 80s, cocktails weren't really big. And likewise in the 40s also, they're not prominent. So cocktails certainly project an aura of sophistication, right, and savoir-faire, and for the person who can get the right spirits, mix it in the right proportions, and serve it in the proper glass, using the right utensils and everything. It might be that I think when wine becomes very popular and spikes in price, sometimes cocktails are kind of anti-snobbery, right? Because spirits are always less expensive than great wine. And at least you don't have to use expensive alcohol in a mixed drink, right? You can use actually something very cheap. So if you have a party, it makes more sense to have cocktails, right? But then, what's interesting about it is some people invent new combinations. They add new garnishes. They create signature drinks that are become to be associated with certain eras. And I think that cocktails become a new kind of exclusive sophistication. So, if you go into San Francisco and order a fancy cocktail, it'll cost you a lot of money. They'll use good spirits, they'll make house-made bitters, they'll use fresh fruit, they'll go 9 yards in making something really exquisite. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but those kind of drinks come in and out of fashion, and I want you to think of what goes on today among people who are called mixologists. They're not bartenders anymore. They study the science of mixing, and add have enormous glasses. Sometimes weird ingredients go in, and the equivalent of what's happened to cooking in high-end kitchens has happened to drinks in very interesting ways. That has invented a whole lot of cocktails. Every bar that's worth its money, worth going to, has its own signature drinks. And even crappy restaurants have their own signature drinks too. But I find it fascinating, and let's talk about that phenomenon when we get into class on Wednesday. Okay, so I'll see you all.